Start webinar. Hello, everyone. This is John Fanning, this year's treasurer, vice president at Integrity Risk, the sponsor for this year's summer workshop. Thank you for taking the time to join us for the Greater Houston Business Ethics Roundtable Summer Workshop. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded and attendees will be muted. We want to make sure this is an interactive session though, so we do have the Q&A activated. It's down at the bottom and you can link in and ask questions at any time. Either during the presentation or afterwards, we will address these questions. We do have some time at the end reserved. This material will be recorded and shared on our website. And with that, I will hand it off to our current president for the Greater Houston Business Ethics Roundtable, Vanessa Rossi, and she'll get us started to discuss a few items about GHBER.
Hi, thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm this year's president of the Greater Houston Business Ethics Roundtable. Thank you for joining our summer workshop. As you know, we have a webinar each day at this same time. Before I kick it off to Joya Williams, our program chairman, to introduce today's webinar and today's speaker, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our sponsor, Integrity Risk International, where John works. We wanted to thank them for sponsoring our event, and I wanted to let you know a little bit about them. So Integrity Risk is a provider of risk management services, including global enhanced due diligence accompanied by a comprehensive due diligence online portal and supported by a database, aggregator, and other sophisticated technology tools. Integrity Risk International also provides services related to beneficial ownership compliance, wealth intelligence, social media diligence, impact investing, and sustainability diligence. They also provide compliance advisory services in several areas, including anti-bribery and corruption and anti-money laundering, among others. And finally, they perform asset inquiries, executive background checks, monitorships, and various safety and security services. Very comprehensive compliance services firm. So now let me kick it off to Joya. Let's get started and let's hear about today's topic and today's speaker. Joya?
Thank you, Vanessa. Today's webinar is called An International Perspective on Emerging Supply Chain Risk. And we are pleased to have Michael Short as our expert speaker on this topic. During the call, remember attendees, you are muted, but you may ask a question in the Q&A on the side panel. We will be watching for questions and we will interrupt the speaker or ask questions at the end. If you're having a sound or technical issue, make sure you can send us a note in the chat. Otherwise, we'll wait to the end for Q&A. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit about Michael Short. I have his bio posted on the screen. Michael Short is a successful entrepreneur who specializes in risk data, compliance, and background screening solutions for international markets. He has over 30 years of international business and governmental experience, primarily in China, India, and the Asia Pacific regions. He is fluent in Chinese and Cantonese dialect. Michael has co-founded, financed, built, and managed 3 of Asia's most successful risk data and background screening businesses. Subsequently, all were exited via acquisition by multinational market leaders or PE firms. These were pre-employment screening provider Quest Research, acquired by FADV in 2005, the global due diligence and risk data pioneer WorldCheck, acquired by Refinitiv in 2011, and the international immigration screening specialist Dataflow, acquired by Swedish PE fund EQ2 in 2015. Michael remains focused on business in the global risk management and risk data spaces and provides business consultancy regarding risk, anti-bribery and corruption compliance, corporate development, and business development projects. He is a subject matter expert on international enhanced due diligence and the design of screening programs for multinational corporations and financial institutions. Michael is the co-founder of the highly innovative sustainability and resiliency solutions provider Ethics Base, where he now focuses on promoting supply chain resiliency. Prior to life in the corporate world and before Hong Kong was returned to China, Michael was a detective inspector in the Royal Hong Kong Police, where he specialized in criminal intelligence analysis, counter-narcotics operations, and proactive organized crime enforcement against various regional Chinese triad-type crime syndicates. Now I will turn it over to our expert speaker of the day, Michael Short. Thank you.
Thank you, Joya, for that comprehensive introduction. It's very kind of you. Now let me see if I can share my screen and get the show on the road. Bear with me one moment. Okay, right. Now hopefully you can all see that. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'd like just to give you an international perspective on emerging supply chain risks. Before I do that, I'd just like to say a little bit about Ethics Base. We are a RegTech business that's based in Singapore and London. We primarily deliver technology and data analytics to assist corporates maintain and create sustainable business practices. Our mission's simple. We want to accelerate the world's progress towards sustainability, really by helping supply chains really up their act in terms of sustainability and resiliency. And we hope that's obviously going to have some benefit for the greater world. We were founded in 2011. Our antecedents really are companies such as WorldCheck, Dataflow, and Complinet. I was one of the co-founders of the company at that time. Since then, we've grown quite nicely. We've now got a global presence with 7 locations across the globe: United Kingdom, USA, Singapore, Malaysia, Canada, the Philippines, India, and Romania. So that's us. But without further ado, let's go on to the agenda. So this morning, I think we'll be primarily talking about sustainability. Sustainability is the big news in the world of compliance internationally at the moment, and it really is all encompassing. So we're going to be looking at some existing and evolving risks, foreign corruption, which I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with and know a lot about that subject already. So I really would be focusing on the emerging risks to the supply chain. So these include the environmental, social, and government issues, and specific ESG issues such as modern slavery and forced labor. So before we start, we'll just get some knowledge and wisdom from Yoda. I think what Yoda's telling us here is we really have to identify risks correctly before we can manage them appropriately, and that's what we're going to do. So what are we really talking about when we talk about supply chain risk? I think we're talking about sustainability, so that's an ESG issue. We're talking about modern slavery and forced labor. We're also talking about resiliency. So what happens if there is a catastrophic failure of compliance or a catastrophic failure of environmental compliance within your supply chain? So we're looking at that as well. And, you know, foreign corruption, to a lesser degree, anti-money laundering, is a massive component of ESG. And we tend to forget that. The G in ESG stands for governance, and the fight against foreign corruption and corrupt practices is a big part of that. So we'll be focusing on those 4 issues. So what is ESG? Well, ESG, environmental, social, and governance compliance. It really is a standardized set of criteria by which socially conscious investors and consumers think about potential investors and potential products that they might like to consume. In our view, the supply chain represents the largest potential risk for companies. But it's also one of the biggest opportunities for companies such as our clients to make a positive impact on the planet by ensuring that there's high levels of sustainability and resiliency within their supply chains. Companies who do take positive steps to improve and elevate the supply chain practices do have a direct impact on sustainability. So it's becoming a really, really big issue. But how large is this issue? Well, you know, traditionally it was it came from a financial point of view. So we had Societe Generale, for example, finding that 2/3 of companies hit by a major ESG controversy saw their stock price underperform. After the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, BP's share price halved. After Volkswagen's emission scandal in 2015, their share price also halved. And similar story with Danske Bank. The Danish financial institution got caught up in a really large money laundering scandal in Eastern Europe, primarily with Russian money, saw its share price half as well. So, you know, companies can take a very, very large financial hit if they haven't got their ESG compliance squared away. To give an indication of how big this issue is and how quickly the situation is changing, in January this year, 19% of all corporate debt, so that's $13.2 billion US, was represented by green bonds. And Standard & Poor's expects the annual issuance of green bonds to grow from 530 billion last year to 700 billion this year. So the finance industry is really behind this. They're really pushing for this, and they're trying to lead the way, primarily from a self-centered point of view, but nevertheless, they're trying to lead the way to a more sustainable way of doing things for business. But this is not really the only issue that we have to contend with. And with the supply chain, what we're really looking at is this, I think. We're looking at three drivers. So we've got a bottom-up driver, a top-down driver, and an aspirational driver. So, for example, a bottom-up driver would be consumer sentiment. So 60% of consumers are willing to pay extra for products from sustainable brands. 70% of consumers under 25, and I think that under 25 demographic is really important, prefer brands based on ethical practices. And 79% of millennial employees, i.e. those under or around the age of 25, are loyal to companies that care about their effect on society. They also support diversity, inclusion, and spend on sustainable experiences. So the market for consumer products, the market for everything that we're actually buying is shifting, and it's shifting into a recognition that ESG is really important, sustainable business practices are really important, and people are going to pay more to get that sustainable experience. And this is incredibly important for the supply chain. We've also got top-down drivers, so global legislation and regulation. So the Europeans have just started putting a sustainable business practice legislation through their parliament. We have the UK government with its modern slavery legislation. We have the Australians with a similar piece of legislation. The Canadians are following. It's becoming quite common for international governments to legislate for sustainability in the supply chain. What happens after legislation? Well, fines. And so you're seeing that top-down pressure coming as well. And there's also aspirational drivers, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So these were adopted in 2015, and they're a universal call to action to end poverty and protect the planet. They are meant to ensure that by 2030, all people, and these are their words, not mine, enjoy peace and prosperity. Now, we haven't got a lot of time before 2030, so there's a lot of talk about acceleration. And these sustainable development goals, there's 17 of them in total, are an integrated approach. So action in one sustainable development goal impacts outcomes in others. And basically what it's doing is mandating and encouraging sustainable development. So as we touched upon earlier, G is for governance, and foreign corruption is a big part of that. And I'm not going to go for a blow-by-blow account of the FCPA here, because I'm guessing that many of the people on this call know far more about it and have far more experience in this than I do. So what I'm doing here is just highlighting the fact that there is international legislation about foreign corruption from the US, also from the UK with their UK Bribery Act, which is not as aggressively enforced as the FCPA, but you know, it's still enforced and it's still meaningful on an international stage. I think the issue to remember here and bear in mind is that, yeah, foreign corruption, there are international regulations and laws around this, but corruption is illegal everywhere. There's not one country in the world which does not think that corruption is a crime. So big part of governance and a big part of what we try and do for ESG compliance as well. So in terms of what's happening overseas, I think one of the big examples that I always try and use on foreign corruption is China. Obviously, China's in the news a lot these days, and it's always been a case study in corruption for commercial operations. And people used to talk about a lot about issues like guanxi in China, the fact that you have to give lavish presents and host lavish banquets and entertain in a very lavish and ostensive way to secure deals. And to a certain degree, yeah, that was very true before, but that's kind of changing now. President Xi has the large anti-corruption drive. People are very reticent about being seen to be overly lavish in the way that they do things, and I think that on the surface has changed in China. However, what hasn't changed in China is that the Chinese market is still huge. You still need to operate in that market in a different way that you would often operate in other more developed markets. There's a lot of use of third-party intermediaries. Often third-party intermediaries are not interested, particularly in China, or do not understand the ramifications of legislation like the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act. We couple that with ownership of vendors and business partners. That can often be opaque. It's not opaque in terms of finding out who owns a company directly, because that's relatively easy and straightforward in China. But it can get opaque once you start going up the ownership chain and you try and determine ultimate beneficial ownership. That is difficult everywhere, and there are secrecy jurisdictions around the world. But in China, it can be particularly difficult to actually get to the bottom of who is the ultimate beneficiary of a business partner. And that obviously creates problems. And we'll touch on that a bit later on in the presentation. There's also the risk of dealing with foreign officials in China. Obviously, the prevalence of the Chinese Communist Party means that you've got a higher risk of dealing with a foreign official in China than elsewhere. I think the Chinese Communist Party had 95 million members at the last count. It's a lot of people, and that's probably 7 or 8% of the population in general. What percentage of the commercially active population that makes up, I don't know, but it's likely to be a lot higher than that. And then also, I think the last issue that you have in dealing with China in terms of foreign bribery is this widespread culture of tax avoidance. You can buy receipts, you can buy a new set of accounts. It's not as concrete as it would be in the UK or the US. And so this culture of tax avoidance means that things can become quite confused at times, and that is often to the detriment of knowing who you're doing business with. Now, I'm sure that sounds familiar to a lot of people on the call who have had dealings in Asia and China particularly. So what do we do? How do we get around that? Well, again, with specific reference to China here, I think we should be sort of going back to basics to actually understand who you're doing business with. And when I was in the police in Hong Kong, we used to always think about the sort of 5-step approach. So we always wanted to know who, what, when, where, and how. And if you can cover those 5 issues, you've pretty much got your story complete and you know what's happened. So this is my 5-track approach to finding out who you're doing business with in China and determining if they're an appropriate business partner. So obviously, first thing, is the company registered? How long has it been registered? Has it been registered specifically for the purposes of doing the deal with your company? Very powerful, and it's a pretty basic step, totally doable in China. Who owns it? Who is the ultimate beneficial owner of that business? Again, can be done, not an issue. It just takes a bit of digging, and it's all public information. And I think the issue here is really, is the ownership of that company connected to anyone within your organization or an agent or third party that you're dealing with who has onward dealings with that ultimate party? We then like to look at the management, and we then try and work out, are they actually the controlling minds, or are there people behind that paper management who are actually calling the shots? And again, that's relatively easy to ascertain. I think that the how bit in all of this is, does the company and does the third party operate where it says it operates, and does it do the things that it's telling you that it does, and does it appear to be credible? Again, with a little bit of digging, very doable. And then obviously, I think the easiest one and perhaps one of the most important ones is ascertaining a track record of corruption. Are the company, or is anyone within the company, a politically exposed person, or are they on any deny lists such as OFAC or any banking deny lists? I think what we're trying to do here is we're trying to determine reputation, qualifications, government ties, and often when we deal with US companies, they like to include a check with the local US embassy, and we'll come on to that in a few slides. So in terms of determining reputation, what we would typically look for there in China and Asia particularly is the partner or state-owned entity. Often companies in China will look like they're not a state-owned entity. They may, for example, be owned by a local university or the research faculty of a local university. But then you go further up the chain and you find out that university is directly funded by the Ministry of Education. So again, it becomes a little bit more difficult than just looking at ultimate beneficial ownership, but totally doable. Obviously, identifying the shareholders, and we're really talking about shareholders, beneficial owners, and influential management. We identify the track record. Now, this is very important, especially in China. And this guy here, Jack Ma, he really was the poster boy of Chinese commerce. So he's the guy behind Alibaba. He was the guy behind Ant Financial, widely touted as China's most successful private businessman. So he was flying. He was just about to do an IPO of Ant Financial in Hong Kong in November last year. Everything was going swimmingly well for him. So he had a great track record. Then he gave a speech, which was, I think, widely considered the turning point in his career. He gave a speech in Shanghai where he criticized the Chinese state banking supervisory officials for being or acting like moneylenders rather than commercial bankers, which went down particularly badly, considering that they were in the room, as were members, high-ranking members of the government. Massive loss of face for these people. Since then, his life has become incredibly hard. And financial, the IPO was pulled. He himself has been very, very low profile over the last 6 months. He's been forced to strike deals and cut in other government-funded corporations in China into his Ant Financial deal. He's rumored to be having to split up the Alipay business out of Alibaba. He's really come under a lot of pressure. And he's come under a lot of pressure because in China, if you're a well-known, influential businessman, it's often can be a pretty dangerous place to be, especially if you say the wrong thing at the wrong time like he did. So his track record now looks very, very different from what it would do 6 months ago. Things change very, very quickly in China. And so I think that's one to bear in mind, especially when you're dealing with third parties. It's not so much who are the people behind the company, it's who are the people behind the company now and how are they viewed now, rather than a longer track record. When we talk about political exposure, I think we also have to look at what does that actually mean. You know, political exposure is a blanket term. This lady here, Ho Ching, is heavily politically exposed in Singapore. She is the wife of the Prime Minister. But she's also someone who, if you really want to do business in Singapore, you really should know her and you really should be trusted by her and you should really be looking to connect into her, because she is the chairwoman and CEO of the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Management Company, Temasek Holdings. So, you know, just saying someone's politically exposed, yes, it is of value, but saying someone is politically exposed and then analysing what this actually means, I think is of far greater value. I think we have to sort of remember that not all political exposed people are bad, and you have to avoid them. You just have to understand that they are politically exposed, and you have to monitor and you have to document the fact that you know that they are politically exposed. I think if you're talking about someone like Ho Chin, you know, the fact that she is so heavily politically exposed, yes, it has been of use to her, obviously, but I don't think it really gets in the way of what she does on a daily basis, and she has got an excellent reputation. Criminal records. We often talk about these overseas, because in the US it's very, you know, it's a very common thing to obtain someone's criminal record and make that information part of any background screening that you do. You have to be a little bit more nuanced with that when you start dealing with this overseas. Some areas overseas, well, most countries overseas, do not consider criminal records to be publicly accessible information. So China, for example, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, these are countries where it is either expressly illegal to obtain someone's criminal record, or it's a grey area, which may lead to criticism later on if you have accessed criminal records. So I would say outside of the US, criminal records, there's not really much point in looking at them, because they're either going to be not in the public domain, or if they are in the public domain, there's no real control over how they are updated, how they are managed, and how they're released. So I tend to dismiss criminal records as being useful tools for due diligence overseas. In the US, they're obviously very, very vital, but overseas, they're not. I mean, we then talk about determining qualifications. Number of ways of doing that. Market intelligence, going out into the market and asking people about the background and track record of business partners. Obviously, everyone does it. Everyone does it with varying degrees of success. I think the one thing to bear in mind here is when you go out and ask people about their opinion, you are actually asking them about their opinion. You're not asking them to do anything nefarious like access information that they shouldn't access, or provide information onwards that they're not entitled or it's not legal for them to do. So when we're doing this, we always focus on opinion only. We back that up with civil litigation searches and local media reports. Civil litigation searches in somewhere like China, yes, they are available, and yes, they are relatively good. They're not comprehensive. They're only as good as the information that's filed, but they are obtainable. It is legally, you are legally enabled to do that. And so it's a very powerful tool. In terms of local language media reports, can be sketchy. In China, obviously, reporters have a habit of reporting on things that they're paid to report on. India, the same. So you have to take local language media with a bit of a pinch of salt. But in places like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, the standard of local language media reporting is a lot higher. And you know, I think you can rely on it a lot more. And the same goes for websites and blogs in those areas. Just circling back to talking about governmental ties, I think the takeaway from me on politically exposed persons would be, one, don't try and do it yourself. Use a PEP database. There's loads of them out there commercially available. WorldCheck, they've got a great one. I'm not just saying that because I used to be one of the owners of WorldCheck, but it is a really good tool. It's updated, and it's got a good understanding of what it actually means in terms of political exposure. I think whatever you do with a PEP database, you have to then really augment that information with local searches as well, just to get that local flavour of what it actually does mean. And then I think circling back to the issue about Ho Ching, is that not all PEPs are bad. Obviously, these two guys, Lukashenko and Putin, I think you really wouldn't want to be in a business relationship with them. But you know, there are some PEPs, and you know, where it's really not an issue. The only issue is knowing. You have to know, you have to monitor, and you have to document. Apart from that, I think you know, the issue is not as large overseas as it would seem. And then perhaps the last sort of point on this is determining ties with the US Embassy. In emerging markets, especially places like Pakistan, this is what the local US Embassy looks like. So good luck with getting any information out of them at all. They've got far bigger and more pressing things to do than deal with a local business trying to find a business partner. So this one really, I think, is one to really bear in mind. Do not rely on the local US Embassy. So what can go wrong? Well, I think we all know what can go wrong with foreign corruption. And these are some figures from our friends over at the FCPA blog. The top 10, we won't go through them. I think there's a common thread that runs through most of the top 10. And that is that these companies dealt with middlemen or agents or representatives in a third country, acting as third parties, and they did not do enough to fully understand the background of the people that they were doing business with. And that, I think, is the common story. And that will continue as long as people do not look carefully and consistently and comprehensively at the background of the people that they're doing business with. So in terms of foreign bribery and how that fits into ESG governance compliance, I think these would be the takeaways. The information is out there. Publicly accessible information outside of the US, especially in emerging markets, does not equate to easily accessible. Some of the information's there, but it can be difficult to find. It's, you know, often in foreign languages. It's filed in a different way than we would be expecting. Information can be peculiar overseas. Always stay on the public side of the line, aim for the best coverage, but be very conservative in the way that you obtain that information. Countries, especially China, have got different and very severe views, I think, on what is a state secret, and it is possible to impinge upon a state secret in China while doing a normal due diligence background investigation. So one has to be very, very careful there. Criminal record searches are not really worth the effort. I would leave them to one side. I think whatever we do, any program to know who we're doing business with has to be consistent, it has to be comprehensive, and it has to be perpetual. And again, from our friends at the FCPA blog, Richard Cassin explains why. Without a consistent effort, you lose your chance to mitigate potential criminal penalties. And I think that's the long and the short of it. So any program it has, comprehensive, consistent. Okay, so moving on to ESG, I think what we're seeing in the environmental and the social aspects of ESG is an emerging focus to supply chains. And I think that's for a number of reasons. I mean, current ESG reporting really does focus on listed and very large multinational companies. It often forgets the supply chain, and it forgets the supply chain because very often supply chains are seen as independent corporate actors. Supply chains can be highly complex, they can span across multiple countries, they're multi-tiered, and so they can be disparate, they can lack common governance standards, and above all, they can be opaque. But unfortunately, supply chains also pose the largest risk to our clients, because the opaque nature of our supply chains can hide issues such as environmental problems, labor abuses, data protection failures, and corruption. And so it's a big issue for them, and it's an issue which is just coming to the fore now. At present, 37% of employees globally are employed in supply chain operations, and in some industries, up to 98% of their environmental impact is manifested through a supply chain. So these are figures from the US Department of Labor and the International Labour Organization. So these are pretty hefty figures. They're they're figures that we can rely on, and it goes some way to explain why the risk in corporations for environmental, social, and government issues has shifted to supply chains. Typically, clients look at us in a different way now in terms of why they use us. Before, when we were dealing with money laundering and FCPA pretty much entirely, it was, we have to screen out bad actors, we have to stop bad deals, and we have to really put a block on deals that are going to put us at risk. Now our clients are looking for different things. They're looking for an improved or protected brand image. They're looking to mitigate down fines. They're looking to enable resiliency and sustainability in their supply chains. They're looking to avoid controversy, and they're looking to be seen positively by that millennial population that's so willing to spend on their products. So we think that the reason why our products are being purchased has changed, and it continues to evolve. So when we look at the supply chain, the two issues that I'm going to focus on this morning are modern slavery and sustainability. Two massive issues. The first one, modern day slavery. What is it? I mean, we've all heard of slavery, and we all understand that, you know, slavery is is incredibly, is a terrible thing. but we often think, well, it doesn't really happen anymore, does it? But it does, and it takes these forms. So typically it's the form of withholding of wages, and that takes the form of debt bondage. So for example, if a migrant worker from Bangladesh wants to go to Thailand to work, he needs to go through an agent because he can't fill the forms in Thai. He hasn't got the deposit in his bank account to enable him to get a visa. He doesn't know where he's going. He probably has never bought an air ticket before. All of these things means practically he cannot move by himself. He needs an agent. And there's some pretty unscrupulous agents out there who will move people to a foreign country to work. But they often will take the first 6 months or 9 months of their salary. They will often retain their travel documents because it takes a lot of time and effort and investment on their part to get this guy to his final destination. They don't want him running away. They don't want him coming home. So they need to keep him there, and they keep him there through modern day slavery, withholding of wages. We've also got the issue of restricted movement. So physical and sexual violence or threats to families. So this, I think, is the more traditional understanding of slavery. And this is where, for example, a girl is kidnapped from a village in Nepal based on spurious promises from a boyfriend, usually. The boyfriend will then arrange for her to go on holiday to India or to cross the border into India. She's then bundled into transportation and taken primarily to either Calcutta or Bombay to work in the red light districts there. And the issue that keeps that young lady in that servitude and in that terrible circumstance is she's told in no uncertain terms, if you run away, remember, we know where you live. We know who your family are, and they will pay if you do not work off your debt here. A terrible state of affairs, but one that is nonetheless all too common at the moment. So that's really what we're talking about. So how big is the problem? Now these figures and these slides are provided by our friends at the Mekong Club, who are an Asian-based non-governmental organisation focusing entirely on modern slavery and supply chains. So they're good people to know, and they very kindly work with us on a number of issues. So how big is the problem? Well, there's over 40 million modern slaves. 62% of them are in forced labour, 38% of them are in forced marriage. So for the purposes of the supply chain, let's look at the forced labour issue. So of that 62%, 17% state imposed. What we're talking about there is jurisdictions like North Korea, for example, and work camps. 19% sexual exploitation, so sex workers who are compelled to work in the sex industry. Now that primarily is in places like India, Bangladesh, Thailand, but it is in the US as well. The sexual exploitation of women is as big an issue in the US as anywhere. But 64% of modern slaves work in supply chains. 16 million people. Big number. So of these 16 million people, 60% of them work in products that we buy. Now that can be, for example, shrimps, which have been garnered unethically by shrimping vessels with modern slaves on in the Gulf of Thailand or in the Gulf of Vietnam. It's pretty much anywhere where people are unable to leave their employment or who have been coerced to work in that particular circumstance. 60%. That's why our clients are so worried about this and are so concerned that they need to do something about it. And is this a problem which is going to go away? Well, unfortunately not. I mean, we often think of two dates. when we talk about slavery, 1833, which slavery was abolished in the British Empire, 1865, the end of the American Civil War. Those dates don't mean anything. Currently, 9.2 million new slaves are being made each year. 25,000 slaves a day, one new slave every 4 seconds. So, I mean, that's just a huge, huge number. It's just mind-blowing. Since we've been talking, there's been 800 new slaves coming into the world. Either forced laborers, coerced sex workers, state detainees. It's just disgusting. But it is here and we have to do something about it. And one of the issues that we haven't spoken about is what actually happens when slaves and forced workers are found in supply chains. Now we've got a British example here, Boohoo. They had forced laborers found in their supply chain. The issue for them was that they lost $1.89 billion in market value in 2 days. So big issue for them, horrendous public relations disaster. They haven't really recovered from it. And to their credit, they've obviously done a lot to try and rectify the situation. But again, that takes time, effort, and investment that could be used elsewhere. One of the issues that is not on my slides and is conspicuously not on the slides is the issue of Xinjiang. I don't put Xinjiang on my slides. I still have members of my family who live in Hong Kong. So if you're wondering what about Xinjiang and Xinjiang cotton and forced laborers in Xinjiang province and all the other issues that stem off from that, happy to have that conversation, but would have that conversation one-on-one with you rather than talking about it in a public forum at the moment. So hopefully you understand. So in terms of modern slavery, what's actually happening? How are we moving away from this, and how are we ameliorating this risk for ourselves in the supply chain? I think the US were the first really to move on this. The US hasn't got national legislation for modern day slavery in the supply chain, but they do have a California Act, the California Transparency Act, which is of some use. The UK came a little later to the party, stipulating reporting and actions for companies over a certain size. Canada is following the UK with its legislation. I think it's closely modelled on the UK legislation. And again, it mandates reporting for companies over a certain size. But I think the largest piece of legislation, the most overarching legislation, will be the EU legislation that's coming online later on this year. It's a directive at the moment, but it hasn't been passed into EU law. And this is going to mandate certain levels of due diligence, certain levels of care and attention, and certain levels of information that you have to know about participants in your supply chain if you are to work, if you are to sell products in the European Union. So things are changing. This is only the start. And I think we can see the direction of travel for ESG regulations on supply chains. The issue that we have really is lack of information. There's no, at the moment, there's no Department of Justice information that comes out which says you need to do these 10 things to understand what your supply chain looks like and understand the level of ESG in it. We don't have that. It's a very disparate map of information which is based on larger companies rather than supply chains at the moment. So those disclosures are often generic. They're often just reported, but there's no call to action behind that report. The methods of collecting and analysing that information is not comprehensive and consistent. And companies often report on different topics. So the information behind ESG compliance is pretty shaky at the moment. And we think that when you're mapping out your supply chain from an ESG point of view, you need to be looking at these issues. And it's everything from climate change to corruption, to monopolistic activity, to product ethics, to diversity and inclusion, local participation, human rights abuses, forced labor. So when we look at companies in supply chains and try and gauge their ESG, this is what we're really looking at. Breaking that down further, there's a number of things that we would recommend that companies do. And we break them down into the following issues. So we look at high impact risk, and that's environmental, greenhouse gas and clean air commitment. Social, we think the biggest issue there, as we've touched on in the presentation, is modern day slavery. Regulatory, foreign corruption. We think that's the biggest risk, and that really is a high impact risk for ESG. Company persona, looking at the company ownership, management, and activity. So there's a level of crossover between what we would look at in an ESG situation as opposed to what we would look at in an FCPA anti-corruption situation. We'd look at the company risk assessment. Again, looking at global compliance databases, we would look to see if someone's politically exposed. We would look at other key risk indicators for ESG. So maybe the Carbon Disclosure Project databases and other such informational sources. We'd look at involvement in past ESG related controversies, such as polluting activities, wasteful activities, modern slavery, corruption. We would document them. So again, a high degree of crossover between what we look at ESG and what we look at an FCPA point of view. But I think the big issue that we always try and highlight to clients when we talk about ESG is often forward-looking. FCPA, money laundering, foreign corruption and compliance is often backwards-looking. So looking forward, we look at resiliency. And we look at how committed are companies to the ESG principles, how committed are they to the Sustainable Development Goals and other organisations with sustainability in mind. How have they invested in leadership and management systems to help their journey in order for them to participate fully in ESG issues? How invested are they in groups such as the Principles of Responsible Investing or the Global Compact from the UN? These are organisations which really propagate the message of sustainability. How involved are they, and how well do they sign up for that?
Hey, Mike.
You look at, for example, their levels of diversity and inclusion at board and senior management levels as well. So we're able to take a management roster table, we're able to break that down. And we do this using an algorithm. We look at in terms of gender split, we look at in terms of ethnicity, we look at how that then stacks up against what we would likely see against a local benchmark. So we do all of this from a third party, standpoint and through algorithms. I think this really is the most important part of ESG. It is not what's happened before, it's where we're going in the future. And that's how it differs. That's how ESG differs from foreign corruption compliance.
Hey, Mike, this is John. I just wanted to jump in. We've got about 5 more minutes. So we'd like to have some time to ask questions. So I just wanted to let you know.
Excellent. Well, on that, you must have been reading my mind, because this is the final slide. And again, Yoda's given us a piece of his mind here, which is, if you're going to do something on ESG, do it. Because the greatest challenge that ESG compliance practitioners have is the suggestion of greenwashing, which is just doing something to make it look like you're doing something. ESG, it's about making impact. And on that, what you said in mind, John, thanks very much. I'll leave it there and happy to take questions.
Great, Mike. I can go ahead and read one of the questions that we have. It actually comes from John Fanning. But my question was, what do you say to naysayers who point out that companies have been hit hard by fines and damages to their reputation, but many of them recover in a fairly short time, such as Volkswagen, which now is profitable. They've moved on and are arguably as well or better off than they were before the emissions scandal. A lot of these scandals, while they may have to pay fines, a lot of these companies recover pretty quickly and might see it as a way to just rather pay the fines than have to deal with all the work that goes into avoiding these things.
Yeah, no, I mean, good question. I mean, what I'd say in terms of Volkswagen is that Volkswagen got a huge fine. They did take a huge hit on their share price. So there was a massive management shakeup afterwards. And if you've seen the latest advertising from Volkswagen, and it's, I don't know if any of you in the States are actually watching the European Soccer Championships, which are on at the moment, but Volkswagen is one of the largest sponsors. And their messaging around the signboards at the grounds is Volkswagen means zero. They've really taken on board the fact that the future is through sustainable vehicles, through electric vehicles, and there's been a mindset change, and I think that's what people expect. They don't just expect people to pay the fine and to move on and just do exactly what they did before. And again, I think this is somewhat different to the financial industry, in that the normal person in the street actually buys these products, and it does really matter what they think. So yeah, I think it is a bit different.
Great, thank you. This one comes from, it looks like someone anonymously, but it says, can you speak to the challenges of doing in-country work, diligence, and investigations in mainland China? Hasn't there been some issues with investigators being arrested and restricted there in the past?
Yes, absolutely. Touching on the issues of public information, one of the problems that you have in China is that there's a piece of legislation which is called the State Security Law, and that really deals with state secrets. Unfortunately, like many laws in China, it's quite widely written, but quite vaguely worded. And so the upshot of it is really, if you release some information into a forum which you haven't had cleared prior to release, then if that is later deemed to be a state secret, you'll get a criminal charge from that. And so this is obviously, China's very political in the way that it handles things, and a state secret which is very innocuous or mundane on one day can completely change the next day depending on the opinion of a party official. You have to be very, very, very careful. I personally know 2 people who've been in prison in China for state secrecy issues. Both of those issues who have arisen through due diligence reporting. They're both very well-known cases. I mean, I've worked in China for years, so I know a lot of the industry figures there. So if you just Google, this issue, you'll come up with the names. But you have to be very, very careful. And if something is sensitive, you can either decide that you don't want to look at it, or you can take a view, well, I don't want to look at it from inside China. I can look at it from outside China. In days gone by, that used to be Hong Kong. We would sit in Hong Kong and write quite fruity reports on companies in China. I don't think I would sit in Hong Kong and write fruity reports on companies in China anymore. Just another indication of how things quickly can change in China. So there are ways that you can protect yourself. You just have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that there is no due process, there is no rule of law, there is no statute law. Really, the law is what your accuser says it is at that time, and what the judge, who remember is a Communist Party appointee working for the Ministry of Justice, which reports directly into the Ministry of State Security, says it is. And so you really have to know that you're on very, very safe ground before you report anything there.
Excellent. Yep.
Fortunately, but that's just the way it is.
No, good. That's great feedback. And yeah, thank you. I think there's 3 other questions, but there's 2 of them that I think one of them from Krista Sparkman. Thank you for the question. Are there any statistics on forced labor in the petroleum industry? You know,
I have got none to hand, but I can certainly find out for you. If you'd just like to give me a quick email afterwards,
I'll do that. Okay, great.
Find some figures for you around that topic.
Fantastic. And then the last one, and then we'll wrap up. Terry Stringer asked, would you discuss the ESG impact recently with Exxon, in which the small hedge fund forced them to add more green-minded members to their board? Do you know much about that?
Only in what I've read from the Financial Times, I must admit. Obviously, it would seem that activist investors who control a pretty small number of a pretty small shareholding in ExxonMobil have, I think it was 2 directors were appointed to the board with a view to hijack the agenda, the development agenda of the company. Now, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Because one, activist investing is on the way, is on the increase anyway. Couple that with the fact that ESG is an easy win, it corresponds to public sentiment as well. I think this is going to be the first of many, and it's going to be the first of many in traditional industries which is polluting. And so ExxonMobil is going to be the first, or has been the first, but look out to see this happening at BP, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, because it's coming, definitely. So it's an interesting one. Sorry, I can't discuss it in any more detail than that, but I am familiar with it, but I'm only familiar from what I read in the paper on it, which is probably as much as you know as well.
Very good. Thanks, Mike. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. If there are any questions, folks, you can reach out to us and we'll get in touch with Mike. I'll hand it off to Joya Williams, I think, to take over for us. He's our chair for events chair.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mike.
My pleasure. It was great talking to you all. And do not, just reach out to me if you want to take anything offline, especially about the issue we discussed in Xinjiang. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again to our speaker, Mr. Short, for this insightful webinar today. Thank you again to John Fanning and Integrity Risk International, and also the GHBER Board of Directors. The recording and the slides will be posted on the GHBER website probably sometime next week. The course has been approved by the Texas Bar. So 1 hour of CLE for each day, with the Friday webinar being approved as an ethics hour. So I know everyone always needs that 1 hour of ethics. So make sure you tune in all week. Please note that you will have to report your own CLE, as GHBER does not report those hours to the bar for attendees. We hope you can join tomorrow for our webinar with Matt Kelly called Current Cybersecurity Challenges. Matt Kelly is the editor and CEO of Radical Compliance. If you have not already registered, please do so. Also, we have our networking dinner sponsored on by Good Company at Good Company Seafood, the Memorial City location on Wednesday evening. The registration link for that is also on the GHBER website. It's open to the first 40 registrants, so sign up today. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining. Thanks again to Mike. Make it a great day, everyone. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.